In this lesson, we're going to create a sign-up page that will let new users register for the sample application, which will put the user model developed in the last lesson to good use. This will involve creating a form to accept new users' information. As shown here, we've seen this page before, but in this lesson we're actually going to turn this into a real working sign-up page. As soon as users sign up for the application, they're going to be forwarded to their profile page. And if you think about it, there's a bit of a chicken and egg problem, because in order to make a profile page, we actually have to have a user. But how can we have a user before we have a working sign-up page? Well, if you followed the last lesson closely, this question has already been answered. Let's take a look at it. At the end of the last lesson, we created a user in the database. So our first step is to make a profile page for this user, and then we'll write the working sign-up form, which will give us a place to send people after they sign up to the website using this form. We'll start by checking the status of our project. Yep, you can see that there are a couple of changes. And these are the changes made in the addendum to the last lesson, so let's commit these. Right, now we're ready to make a new branch. And just to be cautious, let's make sure our test suite is green. Good. All right, we're going to get started by making a profile page. Let's take a look at a mock-up of that. All right, on the left here, we have a mock-up of what the profile page will look like at the end of this lesson. It will just be an avatar and the name of the user, and then we've indicated the header and the footer here, just schematically. And on the right here is a preview of what the full profile will eventually look like, with an avatar and name, and then some links for users that the user is following and the user's followers, along with a list of the user's microposts. The profile won't reach this form, though, until the last lesson of the tutorial, but this profile is a good place to start. Let's take a look at where our application stands. Here's the sample application, and this is the sign-up page. We're going to take a first step by adding some debug information to the site layout. Let's open up the application layout, and we're going to put in some embedded Ruby here. And there's a Rails function called debug. And what we want to do is visualize the parameters that get passed around from request to request. And that's called params. We'll be talking a lot more about this later in this lesson. But for now, we'll see just in the browser what this does. Let's take a look at this. Reload. And you can see here that there's this line that says Ruby hash active support hash with indifferent access. As you might guess from this, it's this params is basically a hash. And you can see it gives us some useful information. It says we're on the user's controller in the new action. And that really is useful, because if you look at the URL, this is actually the sign-up page. Remember, because of our routes, let's take a look at that. We have this named route matched /signup to users new. So it's not obvious from looking at the URL what the controller and action are. But by putting this debug information here, we can see at a glance which controller and action we're using. And as we'll see later in this lesson, lots more useful information is going to appear here. Now there are two problems with this. One is that we do not want this information to appear in general. Right? We only want it to appear on the development site. And in particular, we don't want it on the production server. And of course, there's no particular reason to have it in the tests either. So what we're going to do is restrict this to appear only in development. And there's a way to do that. We're going to say if. So there's a Rails variable available in every Rails application. And one of its attributes is called env for environment. And then there's a Boolean that returns true if the environment is a development environment and false otherwise. By default, Rails supports 3 environments. There's a development environment, a test environment, and a production environment. If you start up the Rails console, you'll see that it starts up in a development environment by default. And we can look at rails.env, development, and we can ask it if it's really development, true. We can also check to see if it's production. Or test. And of course, those are both false. It's possible to run things like the Rails console, the Rails server, and database migrations in different environments. For details on that, see the box in Chapter 7 of the Rails tutorial book. Alright, so with this line of code, the debug information will only appear in the development environment. But there's a second problem, which you probably noticed first, and that's that this doesn't look very good at all. It sort of pushes up against the footer here, among other things. So what we're going to do to fix that is add some extra CSS. This is going to give us an opportunity to use another feature of Sass. Let's take a look at the current style sheet. So what we're going to do is define what's called a mixin. This is going to allow us to define a reusable snippet of CSS. We're going to call it box sizing. There's an attribute called border box that we're going to set, and it actually depends on which browser people are using. This is for Firefox. MOZ is for Mozilla. So we've got that, and we've got one for WebKit. This covers Safari and Chrome. And then we've got just the default generic. Just going to call it miscellaneous. And if you look at the source of the page and find the debug section, you can see here that there's a pre tag, which stands for pre-formatted text. It's essentially just a way of having literal text on the screen. And it's got a class, debug dump. So we can remember the way we style a class is with dot. We can go up to dot center. Here's an example. So we're going to do dot debug dump. Just give it some styles here. And now we're going to include that box sizing. The effect of this is essentially to take this stuff and just stick it in for this. So this would be the same. What's nice about defining a mixin is that we can reuse this box sizing in other CSS rules. Now at this point you might notice that there's no syntax highlighting here for this stuff, this Sass, or this SCSS. This is bothering me enough that I went out and found a Sass highlighter. Just use your favorite search engine to search for Sublime Text Sass, and you can find this, and it has instructions on how to set it up. So now it's got some nicer syntax highlighting. You can see here we've got the ampersand hover. They could do even more, right? They could probably highlight this somehow. But in any case, this looks better. I like that it's not all just white. And our include down here in particular now has some color. Okay, let's take a look at our application now. Reload it. And that looks a lot better. Now it's time to get started with the actual profile page. You may recall from lesson 2 that this should live as /users /1 for the first user, or the user with ID 1. But you can see that right now we have a routing error. So our first step is to get this working. Let's review the standard REST routes for users. Here are the URLs and actions. The three GET requests here at the top are for the page to list all users, the user show page, which is what we're going to have be the profile page, and then the user's new page, which is our sign up page. In this lesson, we'll also be using the post to /users, which will invoke the create action. And then in later lessons, we'll do the bottom three, edit, update, and destroy. Now we could code this by hand, but there's a way to get all of these URLs and action correspondences for free using what's called resources. So let's take a look at how we do that. It's in the routes file. So here at the top of the routes file, we're going to add this one line. So with this one line, resources users, we set up this entire table of correspondences. In particular, if we go back here and reload, now it actually does have a route. So we've got a problem that says the action show could not be found for users controller, but this is a different error. So let's create the users show action. Here's the user's controller, and we're going to have a show action. Let's create a new file, save it. It's going to be in views, users, show, .html.drb. And it's currently blank. Let's just save this and refresh this. Now we actually have a page here. So if you look at the debug information, you can see we've got the action as show, controller, users, and ID is 1. Let's take a quick look at what this params hash gives us. This is something I like to do sometimes. You can just raise an exception using the raise keyword. So we're actually going to see what params looks like. So this is the params hash. And you can see that it's got, we can zoom in a little bit. You can see that there's a key each for action, controller, and ID, and then the values show, users, and 1 corresponding to those keys. Now if you look at this, these are strings, but inside of Rails, these get converted to symbols. So what that means is that if we want the ID, for example, we can use the variable params of ID, or just it's a hash with the key ID. So let's just, for illustration's sake, put the user's name and email address on that page. We're not going to expose the email addresses publicly for the real application, but this is just to show that we can get this stuff out of the database. Notice I'm using an @user variable, which means over here, let's just do this. We're going to be doing test-driven development later, but for now, let's have the controller and the view and the two panes. So in order to get this to work, we need an @user variable here. And remember, we've got the ID now, so we can do this. We can use the find command mentioned in the last lesson and pass it params of ID. So remember, the way to get the value out of a hash is with square brackets, and here we're going to use the symbol ID. Save these two and take a look. And here we see that the user's name appears. Alright, I mentioned that as usual we're going to be using test-driven development. Let's get started with that. Remember, we have a user pages spec that we started in a previous lesson. It's got a little test here for the sign-up page, just to sanity check that, make sure the sign-up path is working, which we have in the routes. That's this here. And then it has some tests for the H1 and the title. So let's make a similar test for the profile page. And it's actually going to be almost exactly the same. Let's just copy these guys. So the H1, let's have the text test for the actual name of the user. So it's a user.name. Here's user.name. So both the H1 and the title will say should have the user's name. And this here, this visit, instead of the sign-up path, it's going to be the user path. and then we're going to give it the user variable. So let's take a look again at these guys, these correspondences. So you can see here that the named route for the profile page is user path and then the ID. You can actually use the full variable. If you call user path on a user object, it just converts the user object into its ID. So this is the structure of the profile page's test, but if you think about it, there's something wrong here, and if we run it, we can see. Yeah, so there's this error message. There are actually two problems. We're actually missing a closed parenthesis here. Let's do that. You probably noticed that. I didn't. Something seemed fishy there. But now let's run them again. And now we've got a failed example. And the problem here is that there is no user variable. Right? We need to have some sort of user inside this test. Now, there are a number of different ways to do this, but the most convenient and flexible, I think, is to use a library for creating data in a test called FactoryGirl, made by a consultancy and product shop called Thoughtbot. The FactoryGirl gem is part of the initial gem installation, but if you don't have the FactoryGirl gem in your gem file, you'll have to add it now, and then run bundle install. So FactoryGirl is a really useful way of creating test data. And the place where the factories live by default is in specfactories.rb. That file doesn't currently exist, so we'll have to add it. Just make a new file and save it. It's going to be in spec. It's called factories.rb. And this is the FactoryGirl syntax. So FactoryGirl is similar to RSpec in the sense that it defines a domain-specific language. In this case, the domain is putting test data in the database. So the way you create a new user in FactoryGirl is like this. FactoryGirl is a movie reference, by the way, as far as I know. So FactoryGirl.define, and then it's a block. And then inside the block, we're going to create a factory. We're going to give it the symbol user, and this will automatically use the user model. So FactoryGirl converts this symbol into the user class. This is also a block. And now we can give the attributes of the user. In this case, I'm going to say the name. I'm just going to use my name. Notice here, name is actually a method. If you wanted to put parentheses around this, it would work. But one of the nice things about a DSL is that you can essentially invent new syntax. And it looks a little nicer if you line these up, at least a little bit. The confirmation is pretty long, so I'll leave that alone, but let's line these up. Okay, this is automatically included by RSpec, so we can go in here and we can create a new user using FactoryGirl. And the way we do that is with FactoryGirl.create. We're going to use let. Remember, you can use let to create a local variable. In the user spec, we did this in the last lesson. We use let here to find a found user, and let to reuse this found user.authenticate. So here we're going to use let to create a local variable called user. So we've just done here. And this user will be created using FactoryGirl's create method. FactoryGirl.create. And what we need to do is give it a symbol corresponding to the thing in here. So in this case, it's a user. Save that. And let's rerun our test. See if it works. All right, so there's a problem here because it says factory not registered user. And this is one of the things that happens with Spork. So these factories are preloaded. Let's restart Spork. All right, so now our failures are honest ones. That's actually catching the two mistakes that exist in the application, because currently the user's name does not appear in H1 and is not part of the title. By the way, I'd like to note that this user symbol here and this one here are actually different. We could call this foobar. right? So in this case, this user symbol here references this one here. And this has to be user because that's how Factory Girl knows that this is a user model. So I just want to show you that there's a bit of a pun there, that there's a what physicists would call a degeneracy, that we use the same name for multiple things. But I think it's clear enough here. All right, now we know how to make this kind of page. We've done a bunch of them. In fact, let's just take a look at one. Take a look at the About page. So here's the About page. Remember that we use provide to provide a title, and then we have the H1. So let's just copy these two, just enough to get our test passing. Replace this. So this title will be the user's name. And the H1 will also be the user's name. Oops, we have to. Actually, this is a good test. So I just blithely put in the user's name. Let's rerun our tests. So we've got 4 examples, 1 failure. If you think about it, it's pretty obvious what the problem is. This is well, actually, let's just look at the web page. So we just have @user.name. The title is right. We can look at the title here at the top. Ruby on Rails tutorial sample app, and then the name, Michael Hartle. But it's just putting @user.name. That's because this should be embedded Ruby. By the way, this user's name could contain potentially malicious code. Remember, users will be picking their own names. So this is a bad idea in general, but Rails actually escapes out any HTML that we insert like this, so any malicious code will be rendered harmless. Save that. In fact, let's just run our whole test suite. Make sure we're green. It's good. Now, before moving on, there's one little detail I want to take care of. If we run these tests, they're actually pretty slow. And in fact, the user spec tests are also slow. The reason these tests are slow is because under the hood, they're using the bcrypt algorithm to create hashed passwords. And bcrypt is slow by design. Part of what makes bcrypt so secure is that it's very difficult to attack because of its slowness. Unfortunately, that means our tests are quickly going to get unbearably slow, but there's a way to fix this. So I want to show you this. We go to the test file. This is in test.rb. Remember we talked about environments. This is in /config/environment/test. You can see here at the top of the Sublime Text window. These configuration settings apply only in a test environment. So it's a really bad idea to mess with these settings in anything other than test. It's especially a bad idea to mess with them in production. But what we're going to do is we're going to change the speed of bcrypt's algorithm. So in order to get this to work, let's put in first a comment saying what we're doing. So bcrypt uses what's called a cost function to determine how expensive it is in terms of computational cycles to perform an encryption. So let's require bcrypt. And then this is the kind of thing that you just have to find somebody who knows what they're doing. Like I just found this somewhere in the dark corners of the internet. So first of all, what we're doing is actually something that you ordinarily wouldn't want to do. So it gives you a warning. There's a way to silence that warning. We wrap it in a silence warnings block. Seriously, I did not know about silence warnings until I found this thing about bcrypt. So there's a constant called bcrypt engine default cost, and we're going to set it equal, we're going to redefine it to bcrypt engine min cost, the minimum cost. So this thing, redefining a constant, is something that ordinarily gives you a warning message. We actually saw that in the console in lesson 4. So that's why we're silencing warnings, because we don't want this warning to appear every time we run our tests. So what this does is it lowers the cost of calculating one of the bcrypt hashes. Let's save that. restart our test environment, restart Spork. And so you can see 3.13 seconds here. Let's rerun it. Yeah, now it's running in less than half a second. And over here, this was running in. Oh, that's a different one. That was Shift Command E. Let's run these guys. Yeah, so now it runs in under half a second. And here you see that our whole test suite was taking 4 seconds almost. Yeah, now it's running in less than a second. And that would only have gotten worse. All right, let's take another look at the state of our application. Here we are. We've got the name of the user, but remember from our mockup where we want to be. So we want to have this avatar image on the far left, and then we want to have the name placed close to the top. So let's get started with that. All of this is going to be inside the H1. So let's start working on that. Let's see, we can get rid of this. All right, so inside this top level heading, this H1, we're going to have the name, and we're also going to have an avatar image. Now, one of the things you can do in an application like this is support image upload. And if you're going to do that, do a web search on image upload in Rails. There are a lot of libraries out there. I think probably the best one that I know of is Paperclip. But these are the kinds of things that change on a fairly regular basis. It's amazing how frequently people write new libraries, and something will become the new hotness. Probably the best algorithm is actually to go to Ryan Bates's Railscasts and see which one he used most recently. We're going to use an alternate solution to this problem, which is to outsource it to a site called Gravatar. Now, the chances are pretty good that you've used Gravatar, even if you don't know it. Gravatar was actually started by Tom Preston Werner, who's one of the founders of GitHub, and it got bought by Automattic, the makers of WordPress. So if you've ever used WordPress, if you have a WordPress account, you almost certainly have a Gravatar. So that stands for Globally Recognized Avatar, and it's really convenient. Now, a situation like this is one of these boundary cases where it's not clear whether you should use test-driven development or not. When making views, I typically focus on the visual appearance without worrying too much about the exact structure of the page. But if I'm implementing something particularly error-prone, then I do tend to write a test for that. One example is pagination in Lesson 9. We'll see in a moment that our current tests do us some good, though. So let's insert some code here. The syntax we're going to use is gravatar4 and then the user variable. So gravatar4 @user. And now if we run our test, this is running the user pages spec, you can see that it breaks, and that's because there is no such gravatar4 method. So the tests are still doing something for us. Now if you go to the Gravatar homepage, you'll learn that the way Gravatars work is they are just associated with an email address. Let's just fire up the console to see how this works. So let's put in the email. So mhartle@example.com is the email address, and if you look at the Gravatar documentation, it uses a particular kind of hash. It uses an MD5 hash. You probably already know this, by the way, but if you're ever confused about things like MD5 or digest or hash, the internet is full of good explanations of this. Like the Wikipedia article on hashing is, I'm sure, quite readable. So the method inside of the MD5 is called hexdigest. And what you do is you put in the email address and get back a hash. Now this is actually case sensitive. If we were to upcase it, we'd get a different hash. And Gravatar standardizes on the lowercase version of the email address. So that means that we need to downcase it. Let's redefine this email address. Put in just capital.com. So if we run hexdigest again, actually let's just run hexdigest on the email. You can see that we're getting something that doesn't match this guy here. So what we need to do is downcase it. Now it's the same as this. So inside this gravatar4 method, we're going to be calling this this digest function, this hexdigest, to create the proper hash, and then we're going to use the standard Gravatar URL. Again, this is the kind of thing you can find at the Gravatar homepage. In fact, let's just take a quick look at that. This is at gravatar.com/site/implement/hash. You can see here the URL, the en at the front for English. And so you can see they just give us the algorithm we need. So once we've got the hash, then you can request either the image or the profile. So if you go to the images, you can see that the standard URL is just gravatar.com/avatar and then the hash. So what our gravatar4 method needs to do is just construct that URL and then make an image to be inserted into the view. So you may recall that we have a full title helper. Let's look at that. The full title helper is here in the application helper. This gravatar is more naturally associated with users, so let's just take a look at the sidebar here. You can see here we've got app, helpers, and there's a users helper that was created automatically when we generated the users controller. So we're going to put the gravatar helper in here. It is automatically available in any view though, so it's actually not tied to a particular controller. This is just a way of organizing code. We could put it anywhere, but it makes sense to associate this with users. Let's put a documentation string here. What does this do? Let's define our gravatar4. And it's going to take a user variable. This is what we have here. I can just put it over here. Notice when I call it over here, I omit parentheses. You can actually omit the parentheses here, but it's really awful. I think it's horribly ugly to define methods without using parentheses, so this is the convention I use. And let's define the gravatar ID, which is just that hash. All right, so let's call the user's email and then downcase it. So that's our gravatar ID, and then we can build up the gravatar URL as follows. Double quotes here are actually important because we're going to use interpolation. And that's it. If you look at the gravatar page, you can see that we just need /avatar/ then the hash. So this is the final URL. And now we just need a way of linking to an image to that URL. So recall from the home page, we've actually done this once before. Here we've got a link to the image tag and then the location of the image, which in this case is local, just rails.ping, and then we have an alt text. In this case, what we want to do is have an image tag to this external URL, which is just the gravatar URL. And let's have the alt be the name of the person. And let's give this a CSS class, which is going to be gravatar. Let's run our test just to make sure we're still working. Let's run the user pages spec. All right, so it's not obviously breaking. So let's take a look at the actual application. And what we see here is the default gravatar image. And of course, it couldn't be anything other than the default because the email address here is mhartle@example.com, and example.com is reserved as for examples. So to my knowledge, there are no email addresses there. So let's update our user's attribute here to correspond to an email address that actually has a gravatar other than the default. Let's go to the console. Pull out our first user. And now I'm going to update the attributes of this user. Say this is a generic example user. So we're going to use the email address example at railstutorial.org. Now I control that domain, as you might guess, and so I've associated this email address with a non-default gravatar. In order to finish this, we do need the password and the confirmation, which you may recall as foobar. Actually, we could change the password here. If these, as long as these match, that's all that matters. It's not actually authenticating it here. All right, so now we've got a new email address, and let's reload this. And there we go. Now we see that instead of the default gravatar, there's a gravatar corresponding to the Rails tutorial logo. Let's take one more look at that mockup. So we've got the gravatar in the name, but what we really want is to have it to the left and have the text in the right place. So we'll implement this as a sidebar. We're going to start a user sidebar here on the left side. If you look at the mockup for the full profile page, you'll see this is where we're going eventually. So this stuff here on the left is going to be the user sidebar. Let's go to the user show page. So what I'm going to be putting in here now is, it's not necessarily obvious where it comes from. In fact, our Rails tutorial reader actually did the redesign of the site using Bootstrap. We're going to use a div with a class that's equal to row. This class has special meaning to Bootstrap. Then we're going to use the aside tag, which is used for content that complements the rest of the page, but can also stand alone, which is what a sidebar is. And we're going to give it a class, span4. This spans 4 columns. Again, this is related to the way Bootstrap arranges elements on a page. This is with respect to a grid. And then we're going to put this inside a section. And then we'll just close off these tags. And move this over. There we go. And now to style this, there's a bunch of CSS. Let's go to our CSS file. I'm going to put some CSS here for the sidebar. And most of this I'm just going to copy from the book. I'm just going to copy it from the online version of the book and just paste it in here. You can see that there's a lot of nesting. This is evidence that we've got SCSS and not just plain CSS. And I'm going to put in the gravatar rules by hand. Or .gravatar for the gravatar class. And I'm going to float it to the left. And have the margin on the right be 10 pixels. Let's see what that looks like. And that looks pretty nice. Let's close down some files in preparation for the next step. Now we're ready to create the actual sign-up form. Let's take a look at our mock-up one last time. This is roughly what our sign-up form will look like. It'll have name, email, password, and confirmation fields. And the task for the rest of this lesson is to make this form and then have this create my account button actually create a new user in the database. Before getting started, let's clear the database out. We created a user by hand, but we're about to give our application the ability to create new users. Let's get a fresh start. The way to do this is with rake db reset. Again, you might have to type bundle exec there if you haven't set your system up not to need to use bundle exec. This can script the tests. So after running the reset, you should re-prepare the test database. I actually don't know why this happens. All right, now we're ready to write some tests for user sign-up. The way we're going to do this is to add a new describe block. Instead of describing the sign-up page or the profile page, this is just going to describe sign-up itself. And so at this point, we're really going to start seeing how great Capybara is. The syntax that it supports for visiting web pages and taking actions is really amazing. So in order to get started, let's look at the mockup. So let's think about how to describe the behavior of this page. What we want to do is visit this page, which we know is at the sign-up path, and then we want to fill in this name field with some valid name, email, password, and confirmation. In fact, we want to test both cases. We want to test the case of submitting valid information and also submitting invalid information. So let's go back to our test. And before anything, we want to visit the sign-up path. And then we want two describe blocks, one each for submission with valid information and with invalid information. Let's do the latter first because it's actually easier. So what should it do? It should not create a user. We'll fill that in a moment. With valid information, well, it should create a user. So let's do that. Right, and now we need to fill in these two sections. Let's start with invalid information. So if you just go to this page, the sign-up page, and click on Create My Account with blank fields, that's certainly not a valid submission because we've got validations on the name, email, password, and confirmation. So let's have this invalid information describe block start with the before, right before visit sign-up path, and then what it's going to do is it's going to click the button, and that shouldn't change the number of users in the database. So that's how we're going to enforce this idea that it should not create a user. So let's just recall in the static pages spec that we've got these tests that we used for the layout links. So you can say click link about, click link help, where click link comes from Capybara, and it takes in the text of the link, and then it actually just clicks that link in the test. So as you might expect, based on that behavior, Capybara also has a method called click button. We can just give it the text, which is create my account. And we want this not to change the number of users in the database. So you may recall that there's a way to find the number of users. Let's look at the console. So user.count gives us the number of users in the database. And you can even see the SQL, select count star from users. And the answer right now is 0 because we did the break DB reset. So what that means is we can capture that number in a variable. The old count is user.count, and then we're going to click the button, and then the new count is user.count, and then our expectation is that new count is equal to old count. So let's save that. And actually, I'm going to make this a pending spec here. Let's just run this. All right, so we've got one failing spec as we expected. So now let's go to the sign-up page. This is going to be in new.html.erb. And so what we're going to do is replace this paragraph tag with a form for new users. Let's put this over here. We can see that we have a user on the show page, user.find. The new page is also going to need a user. This actually isn't strictly necessary, but it's much more convenient to make a form if you already have a user object. Rails does a lot of cool things automatically. So what we want to do is create a user here with no attributes, because right now it's just a blank user. The way we do that is just with user.new. And over here, we're going to use what's called a form for. So we're going to create a form for a user. And this form for takes a block as an argument, and we're going to call the form variable f. It's the usual convention, just for form. And let's put in the end. Now inside Form4, there are special Rails helpers to make the HTML for the form. Typically, forms consist of a label and then either a text field or a password field. So let's put those in. Remember, from our mockup, we have the label is name. So this is another good example of an abstraction layer in Rails where there's this object, a form object. We don't really know what it is exactly. So its behavior is really defined by how it responds to methods. And so f.label, if you give it a symbol corresponding to one of the attributes on this model object, it automatically knows to call this name with a capital N, like here. We'll see in a moment. And then we want a text field. You can see here, we want a text field for the name. And then we want the same thing for email. So just copy these. And now for the password, we actually want to use a password field. So let's do that. Now you can see from our mockup that we actually want the label here not to be password confirmation, but just the word confirmation. So there's an option here, and we can just pass an optional parameter with the text of what the label should be. And then we want a submit button. This is the way to do this is with f.submit. With the text, and then we're going to give this some classes. These are specific to Bootstrap. These identify it as a button. Let's take a look at it. Let's go to the home page, and then there's a link to sign up now. So this is a very common error. You'll get undefined method and then something for nil class. And so what that means is there's something nil that we don't want to be nil. And you may recall in lesson 4 I mentioned that instance variables are nil by default. So this is almost always the result of an undefined instance variable. So let's take a look at our code here. Yeah, so you can see we define @user here, but as indicated by the circle here in the tab, this is actually an unsaved file. In fact, it's probably a good idea to use option command S to save all the unsaved files. All right, with that, our page should be rendering. Let's take a look at it. There it is. All right, so this looks okay. It's definitely not done. We're going to defer the rest of the design work until after we've gotten it working. But for now, you can see that we have our proper fields and we've got this button. The difference between a text field and a password field is something you're already familiar with, even if you don't realize it. If we do example user and then put an email address, I'm not going to do that right now. If we put in the password, it doesn't show the actual text you type. So that's the difference between a text field and a password field. Let's see what happens if we just submit this. It's a good hint about what we're going to have to do next. It says the action create could not be found. So let's go back and run our test, see where we are. Just run this one test. All right, so it's failing. So it's failing because it can't find create. So notice the click button actually did work though. So what we need to do now is to define a create action. Oh, and actually this new should be below the show, just by convention. So let's do that. This is good test-driven development. We're just going to do one thing at a time. Let's rerun our test. And now it says it's missing the template, action view missing template. If you think about this, we actually don't want to have a template for create. Create is going to create the user and then redirect to the profile page. Or rather, it'll redirect to the profile page if it successfully creates a user. Otherwise, it should just render back this new page. So since we're working on the situation for invalid information, let's just render new. Let's use the render command, and then it takes in the name of the action. So let's do this. It's actually not the name of the action, it's the name of the template. Okay, so now we're getting the same problem. So this is actually the distinction between calling the action and just rendering the template. So what it's doing here is it's rendering this new template, but it's not going through the new action, so there's no @user. That means we do need an @user variable here in create. So let's save that. We're just doing the minimum that we need to get this thing to pass. Let's see that. Ah, look at that. So now it's actually passing. So what that means is if we go back to this page and click Create My Account, it should do something sensible. So you see what happened there is it just re-rendered the new page. By the way, this URL doesn't change. It's still at /users. And I consider that a minor wart in Rails, but it's not a big deal. Now one of the things you can see here is that the name in the hash, remember this is the params hash from debug. So down here we have the params hash, and you can see that there's a key, user. So params of user is going to contain the following hash. This format, by the way, is called YAML, which is a very hackerly kind of acronym. It stands for YAML Ain't Markup Language. But YAML is a really nice human-readable form of these kinds of data structures. In fact, let's just look at the console for a second. Let's initialize a new params hash. Params of user, let's just give it a name and email. And now let's see what this looks like in YAML format. So you can see that you just use the Y command. This prints out the result in YAML. And so what we've got here is very similar to what we've got in terms of the hash here. There are slight differences, but it's almost the same. So you can see that when params of user has this hash as its contents, so that the whole thing is a nested hash, the YAML output is basically what we've got here. You can see now why this debug information is so useful, because it lets you see what's happening when you submit forms. All right, so let's take a look at the second of our tests. So it should create a user when the information is valid. So how are we going to submit valid information? Well, we've got our sign-up path there. We visit the sign-up path. And then what we want to do is fill in the different fields with valid information. And there's a fill in command provided by Capybara for just this purpose. So fill in name with a valid name. You can fill in email. And we want the same thing we did here before. Let's just copy it. Old count is equal to user.count, and this stuff is also the same. And except in this case, the new count should equal the old count plus 1. So let's save that. So how are we going to get this test to pass? You actually might be able to figure out almost all of this. There's only one element that you might not quite get. Well, first let's run it. Alright, so the submission is actually happening because we have a working form, but it's saying that it expects the new count to be old count plus 1, expected 1, got 0. So what we want to do is, in the case of this create action, if this user is a valid new user, we want to save it to the database and then redirect somewhere. So eventually we'll redirect to the profile page, but right now I'm going to redirect someplace that's actually wrong so that we can write a test for the proper redirect later on. So you may recall that we have a way to create a new user object. In particular, this params hash has exactly the information needed to create a new user. So let's call user.new here, and we're going to give it an argument, params of user. By the way, if you wonder where this, how does Rails know to use this user symbol, the answer is that it figures it out from the class of this object. It actually doesn't matter what this is called. This could be called foobar, as long as it matches it in here or in here. But it uses the class of this to construct the params hash with the key user. So this is @user. Remember that we can determine if a user is valid or not, either by calling the valid question mark method or simply by trying to save the user and then testing whether that save is true or false. So if @user.save is true, so we can just say if @user.save, we're going to, let's redirect. We'll redirect somewhere wrong. We'll get this right later on. Else, let's render the new page. Let's try this. Rerun our test. I actually thought that might work. Let's see what's wrong. Oh, what's going on here is pretty obvious if you just follow along. We forgot to click the button. So of course, didn't actually work. So let's try this now. Try to run it again. There we go. So now it's actually working. So what that means is we actually have a working registration form now. It's amazing. All right, there's a lot more to do, but it's pretty impressive that we actually already have a working sign-up form. We'll see throughout the rest of this lesson, though, the difference between having essentially a prototype and having an industrial strength website. We're going to start by refactoring these tests a little bit. There's actually a much slicker way to do this. We're going to first create a binding. We have this click button, create my account. There's some duplication though. It's in two places. So I'm going to copy that and use the let command. And I'm going to define a submit command. So submit. Let submit be this text. So that we can say click button submit. Let's run this whole test file. There we go. So in this refactoring, this should be passing the whole time. Just make it a little smaller. All right, there's also a cooler way to do this, this idea of old count, user, and new count, and then comparing them. We can actually turn this into a one-liner using what's called expect. So we expect, and then we give expect a block, and then we can put stuff inside this block. In fact, it can even be a multi-line block. And then we can test the result of that block. So what we want to do is we expect that click button submit will not change the user count. That's what all this stuff is with this old count, new count, and that they should equal each other. That's just expressing the idea that clicking the button should not change the user count. And so we can actually do this directly in our spec. We can say we expect click button submit not to change the user count. And the way to do that in our spec is we give it the class and then the method that we're using, in this case count. We want this not to change the user count. So we give it a symbol corresponding to that method. So this one-liner replaces the previous stuff. So let's rerun the tests. There we go. Still passing. And we can pull a similar trick here in this section. So first of all, we can actually take this stuff and hoist it into a before block. And then inside here, we want the same kind of thing. We expect that click button submit. Well, what do we expect this to change the user account by 1. And the way to do that in our spec is just with another method called the by method. So by 1. Just like natural language. Close that off and save it, and let's rerun the tests. Now at this point, let's add one more test that we want to describe what happens after saving a user. And the main thing we want is for it to redirect to the user's profile. And the way we're going to test for that is we're going to actually pull the user out of the database and then verify that the title of the page has the user's name. Use let here. We're going to let the user be, remember how to find a user. There's a unique username, which is the email address. We're going to find by email and then just the user's email address. And it should have selector, title, and the text should be the user's name. Let's run that. This should fail. And now we can go over here and redirect to the user path. Remember, we can just give it the user itself. And in this case, it's @user. Rerun the tests. It's failing. I thought that might have passed. What's wrong? Oh, the problem is in this block, we need to click the button. So before anything happens here, we need to click the button. So the way these expects work is that they need to wrap this thing inside the block, which is why I made another describe block for this, so I can click the button again. Okay, so now this should work. There we go. So now we actually click the button, we find the user, and then we test the contents of the page. Right, we're doing really well here. We actually have a working sign-up form, and we've just refactored our tests, and everything is working now. There's one little refactoring I want to do right now. So we're testing this redirect. There's actually a shortcut for this. Instead of saying user path @user, we can just say @user. Rails is smart enough to redirect to the user's page. So this is redirecting to /user/ whatever the ID of this user is. So let's rerun this test. There we go. So now let's actually take a little time to style this form HTML. Remember, it's working, but it doesn't look very good. All right, so let's go over to this. Oh, that's unsaved, actually, what happened there. Make sure it's working. Here we go. Okay, so let's put in some new CSS classes. I'm going to put in a couple divs. I think it's a good idea to put in the closing divs here. And we've got this. And these are specific to Bootstrap. This is spanning 6 columns and offset by 3. And let's put this in. Oops, the end didn't go. Let's go here. There we go. And reload this and see how that looks. Okay, it's looking better. We still need a little more CSS though. Let's put that in. Let's put in some CSS for forms. It would be very surprising if you could guess much of this. It's the kind of stuff you would learn in a course on web design. And here we're actually going to be able to reuse this mixin, this box sizing that we made before. In fact, I can just copy it here. Save that. Let's take a look. And that's pretty good. That's I'd say we've achieved our mockup here. All right, so we can close this down. So now that we've got our HTML working, I want to take a look at the actual source of this. This is the kind of thing that eventually you'll get out of the habit of doing, but at this point I think it's a good idea. So let's take a look at this. We've got our div class equals row just to orient ourselves right here. So that's this. And so all this form stuff in here, this is what's generated by that form for. So you can see that based on having this @user variable, Rails infers the right action. It actually knows that this is a new user. And then it gives a class and ID to the form. And then there's some stuff in here. This is a security precaution. You don't actually have to worry about this. Rails takes care of it for you. If you're interested, you can read about cross-site request forgery, or CSRF. That's what this is protecting against. And then you can see that there's a label for user underscore name and ID user underscore name. And then the name here, the name of this input, this name and this name are just coincidental. If we'd used full name instead of name, this here would be full name and this would be name. So this is an HTML element. And so part of the way that Rails works is it gives these elements this name, and this is how Rails constructs this kind of hash down here. Let's do it again. Click on this, and you can see here that this is how Rails constructs the hash. It's based on these submitted values. So by comparing the HTML source with the source code here, you can infer what each of these elements does. And then by comparing this HTML with what it actually looks like, you can figure out what each of these HTML elements does. Now you might have noticed that I've submitted invalid information here. And there are a couple of things that happened. One is that although the password and confirmation fields were cleared, it actually returned this the name and the email address. And the way it's doing that is from here. If we look at this @user, Rails is creating a user with certain attributes. And in the case where the save fails, which is what we've got here, it's rendering the new page. And because it knows the name and email address based on these params, it can actually pre-populate those fields. Of course, it knows the password and password confirmation too, but by default it doesn't pre-populate these fields just for security reasons. So one of the conventions that's very useful on the web is to have some error messages that tell us what's wrong with our form submission. In this case, we might want to say that the password doesn't map to the confirmation. If we had invalid email here, we could do just this. We want this to give us some error message that says that the email is an invalid format, and in this case I just submitted an empty password and confirmation, so it should indicate that as well. So let's take a look at the Rails console to get a sense of how we're going to go about doing this. Let's put a new user in memory. So user.new. There's an invalid email address, and then let's put in a password that's too short. Remember, it has to be 6. So if we save this user, it should return false, or we try to save. It says false. That's right. Nope. There's an object now that has been created on our user that contains the errors. And it's just user.errors. So you can see this is actually an object, and if you look at it, there are actually some messages here, some error messages on the different attributes. And the way to pull those out is with full underscore messages. So this returns an array of the messages. Email is invalid, password is too short, minimum is 6 characters. So these are reflections of the validations. We make these validations on email and password and the name. Rails automatically translates this validation into these error messages. That means we can display these error messages when a user submits invalid information. We're going to do this with an error messages partial. Let's create the partial. Create a new file here and save it to views. I'm actually going to make a new folder. This is for shared items. We're going to be using this for our micropost later on. And then we're going to call it error messages. Remember, partials start with an underscore. So what we want to do is print out the error messages if there are any. The way to do that is to put in some embedded Ruby here. And we want the one that doesn't have an equal sign because we're going to have an if. So we actually don't want to insert this into the template. We just want to have some embedded Ruby evaluated. If at user.errors.any question mark. So it turns out that, let's go over to the console, clear it out, and let's do user.errors.any. That's true if there are errors. So let's say if there are errors, and I'm going to just put in some divs here with some CSS classes. Actually, I'm going to use an ID here. Let's say the form contains some errors, and this is a really tricky little thing, but I like it a lot. I want to say how many errors the form contains, and one of the things you'll see on the web very commonly is that you'll see something like 1 errors, and I hate that, especially when it's so easy to avoid it. The way we're going to avoid that problem is by using the Rails pluralize method. We're going to pluralize at user.errors, and errors has a count. Let's go over here. Tells us how many errors there are. And pluralize takes the count and then a word that is pluralized if the count is something other than 1. So we want a singular there, pluralize at users.errors.count. So this will be the word errors if the count is 0 or if it's 2 or more. And if it's 1, it'll just say 1 error. And now I'm going to put in an unordered list of the errors themselves. So what we're going to do here is just iterate over the full messages that we saw here before. We saw this. We're going to iterate over these and just print them out. We don't need an equals there because we're not going to put this into the template. At user.errors.full messages. Remember, we're going to use the each method for each of these. And we're going to have the message. This is put in the closing. There's the end, and then we're going to have a list element, an li, and let's just put in an asterisk and then put in the message. So now let's just go over here and we're going to render these error messages. The way we render this is in the shared directory and then the name of the partial. Let's save that and let's go back here and see what happens. Look at that. We've got a bunch of errors. Now, the styling is no good. So let's put in some CSS to fix that up. This is still in our form section, so let's put in an error explanation ID, right? So IDs are styled with this the octothorpe. F00 is red. Inside this, we'll style the UL. And now we're going to use a CSS class that comes for free when you submit a form in Rails. Actually, let's take a look at it. Oh, this is wrong. This whole thing should be wrapped in an error explanation div. And this should be in one. Actually, probably two. So we actually want another div here. So we're going to give this a couple of classes. And close this div. Okay, now this is right. I need to put this over 1. I was wrong. We just have to dedent this. Okay, so let's submit this again, see what happens. There we go. So this this alert and alert error class, these guys are part of Bootstrap, so that's what gives us this nice red here. And let's look at the source of this. If we go down here, you can see that Rails has wrapped each of the labels and inputs in this class, field with errors. This happens automatically. So we're going to style that. Let's do dot field with errors. And now we're going to use a really powerful Sass command called extend. So what extend does is it says if you give it a class, we're just going to apply all of those same styles to field with errors. So it turns out what we want are what are called control group, and there's an error class. So if you go searching through Bootstrap, you'll be able to find these classes. Let's reload it and see what it looks like. Actually, let's resubmit it. Ah, there we go. That looks nice. So now our errors are red, and these the fields that are in error have a different color. Now there's one thing you might notice here that's kind of annoying. It says here that password confirmation can't be blank. That's fine. Password is too short. Password can't be blank. But it also says password digest can't be blank. And that's because if you look at the user model, we have this has secure password. So what's going on there is that has secure password has a validation on password digest, and that's bubbling all the way up to this this sign up form. In fact, there's something else you might have noticed, which is that we don't have any tests for these error messages. I mean even for their presence. I'm actually not going to write detailed tests for these guys because it pretty much all comes for free with this full messages. But we will write a test later on just to make sure that there is some sort of error message appearing. So at the end of this lesson, I'll solve several of the exercises from chapter 7 in the book, including a test for the appearance of error messages and an exercise that gets rid of this password digest can't be blank. All right, so this completes the failed sign up. There's only one thing I want to do before actually making a valid submission, which is to have a friendly message that appears after the user is redirected. So the idea is that after a successful submission, we're going to have a message that says essentially welcome to the sample application. This uses a really convenient feature in Rails called the flash. And the name is an analogy with flash memory, and that it stores data temporarily. So what's going to happen is we're going to put something in the flash. We'll see how to do that in a moment. Then we're going to click create my account, and then it's going to have a welcome message on the new page. So let's see how that works. So the flash basically works like a hash. And so what we're going to do is we're going to put something in the flash right before this redirect. We're going to give it a key, success. And we're going to have a friendly welcome message. Welcome to the sample app. And we want to display that on the page, on the user's profile page. And so there's a useful convention, which is to output the flash on the site layout so that anytime there's a flash, it will show up on the page. So here's application.html.drb. So what we're going to do is actually iterate through the flash. Let's take a look at this. So this is going to be some embedded Ruby, and we're not going to insert just this thing. We're going to we're going to iterate through the flash. The flash is basically a hash. Remember, the way to iterate through a hash is by key value pairs. So we're going to say flash.each do, and then there's going to be a key and a value. I'm going to end this. And now we're going to insert this div with a class equal to alert, which we just used here. It's on the error messages partial. It's the same one. In fact, we want both of these same classes. We want alert and alert error. But instead of error, we actually want it to be the name of the key. So because what we're doing here is we're actually putting this the success in. Let's put this over here for now. So we're going to have this this value, or this key rather, that's success. So what we want to do is insert that right into here. We can do that with embedded Ruby. Put the key in there. So it's going to have a class that depends on whether this is success, error, or there's a third one we'll use, which is notice. We're going to have a class there set by the key, and then we're going to put the value in directly. Close this off. And by the way, if this looks ugly to you, this is horrible. This line is, especially like sticking this in here, it just looks awful. So what we're going to do at the end of this lesson is write a test for this, and then we'll refactor it. You might recall from the error messages that we had a nice styling on this guy. Let's just take a look at it. Right, so this styling here comes from Bootstrap, this red and like the red background. And Bootstrap supports all three of the kinds of flash keys that I mentioned. That is success, error, and notice. So let's save this. And at this point, we're actually ready to create a new user. So let's call the user Rails tutorial in honor of this tutorial. And the email will be the one we used before, example@railstutorial.org. And password foobar. Let's create the account. Is it going to work? Let's run our tests. All right, the tests are passing. The tests claim that this is going to work. Let's see if it does. And there it goes. There's a new user. Welcome to the sample app. So this is the flash, and you can see the styling that comes from using Twitter Bootstrap. So what's cool about the flash is that it appears only on this request. So I'm just going to refresh the page, Command R, and the flash should disappear. There we go. So that's what the flash does. It's just this message that appears on one page and then disappears as soon as you refresh or as soon as you click on another link. All right, there are just two main things left that I want to do. First, I want to solve the exercises from Chapter 7. So if you haven't solved those exercises, you might want to try them now. These exercises include a few more tests, so we'll be a little bit more secure in the correctness of our application. And then I'm going to deploy to Heroku. And it's going to be a little tricky because I'm actually going to use a secure deployment. We're going to use SSL on the live server. And as a final step in this lesson, we'll actually create a user on the live web. Yeah. So let's start with the exercises. The first exercise is to define an enhanced gravatar. So let's go to the user helper, or users helper. So we're going to make an enhanced gravatar method. So this is the gravatar4 here. And so what we want to do is add an option so that you can change the size of the gravatar. So there's a way to do this with what's called an options hash. options equals, and we're going to give it a default option. Size is going to be 50, that is to say 50 pixels. And inside of this, this Gravatar method, we're going to pull out the size. Just for convenience. And there's an option to this Gravatar URL. We can pass it a parameter. It's question mark s equals the size. And so we can just interpolate. And everything else is the same. So let's see how that works. Let's go to the user show page. So Gravatar for user, and we can say size 100. Save that and show what that does. See, it just makes a bigger Gravatar. We can make it 200. Or we can make a smaller one. We can make it, say, 20. This is a useful thing to be able to do, and we'll be using it later on in the tutorial. The default is fine, though, for this case. Next, we'll write a few tests for the error messages. Let's move this over here. Just move all this stuff over here. And so, user pages spec with invalid information. Let's describe the rendered page. So this is actually after submission. This is an analogy with after saving a user. We're just going to say after submission. It's after, really it's after not saving a user, but that seems kind of weird to specify here. So we're going to say before, we're going to do the same thing we do down here. We're going to just click the submit button. Remember, submit's defined right here. It's just this string. And then, well, it should re-render the sign-up page. So let's test that by saying it should have the title sign up. Have selector title Texas sign up. And it should also at least have the word error. Now, in the past, I've really overspecified this, and it's bitten me. So I've learned that it's a good idea just to say that it should have content. This just checks the content of the page, and it should have the content error. Let's run this whole test suite, or run this file, so it's passing. Now let's break it, just to make this is our sort of after the fact TDD. Should fail. Good. And I also want to make sure that it doesn't say password digest. Because remember, we want to get rid of that. That's stupid that it says password digest. So that's failing, which is good, because that's what we have right now. If we go to the sign up page, it has this password digest can't be blank. So we want to not have that that appear. So this is another exercise, and this is a little tricky. I had to do some serious web searching to find out how to do this. And the answer is you go to a file in config locales n.yaml. So let's look and see where that is. It's config locales. This is actually part of the internationalization, and so n.yaml is just English. This is just something I found on the web, so let's put it in. We don't need this hello world. So it turns out what you do is active record, attribute, user, password digest. We just want to change this to the word password. Let's try that. So you can see we've introduced another error here, that password can't be blank appears twice. So one way of fixing this problem is to get rid of the password presence validation on the user model, because after all, if the password is blank, so is the password digest. So we can do this and get rid of this presence validation, and that means that we should look at the user spec and run it. It's probably going to have a failing spec. Oh no, it still passes, so that's really good. So it really does show us that it's unnecessary. In principle, we could write a test to catch that duplication, but I think it's more trouble than it's worth. Let's try it again. Yeah, now it's working. And finally, I want to write a test for the flash. It's going to be here in the user pages spec. We've already got one of the things we have after saving a user. We have the title, which is the user's name. And it should also have a div with the right classes with the text that matches the word welcome. Now, this is one of the things where it's easy to over-specify the text of the flash, because if you go over here and go to the user's controller, we really don't want to test this whole message, because maybe we changed the message. So at this point, we're just going to specify that it has the word welcome. And this is the kind of thing that if this breaks more than once, I would just get rid of the test for the actual text. So let's just implement it, and we can talk more about it. So it should have selector, and it's going to be a div. Now this is a cool way that have selector can actually test for classes using the same CSS notation we've seen before, where you use a dot for a class. Well, let's take a look at what it should be. This is in the application layout. It should have the class alert, and it should have the class alert -success. By the way, you might notice here that when embedded Ruby inserts the key is actually a symbol, but it knows to call the toS method on the symbol, so it just inserts the string corresponding to the symbol. So this is actually a pretty good test. I'm going to add one extra piece, but seriously, if this broke more than once, I'd just get rid of it. Okay, so let's run that test. Should pass. That was just that one example. All right, so now let's break it. Actually, let's just delete it here. Rerun the test. Now it fails, so that's good. We've got a valid test for this flash. And now we can refactor it. So there's a really cool method in Rails called content tag. And it takes a symbol that is the tag you want to make. By the way, I should mention that all these things are in the API. So if you go to the Rails API and type content tag, it gives you all kinds of good examples for how to use it. So content tag div, and then the value, and then any classes. So in this case, the classes are alert, and alert with a hyphen and then the key. So you can see here that we've replaced this awful embedded Ruby inside of HTML with a much nicer variable interpolation right here. I've actually had people email me about this line saying, there's some too many angle brackets, and it's just because it's so difficult to parse this visually that it looks wrong, although it's actually correct. So let's get rid of this line and rerun our test. And there we go, it's still working. So at this point, our application is running quite smoothly. Let's run the whole test suite. There we go. So we've got a valid sign-up form and lots of nice little details like error messages and a flash. Let's add everything here. Finish the sign-up form. Let's check out the master branch, and we'll merge it in. And it's a good precaution to run the test suite. Again. It's great. I'm going to push it up to GitHub. And now we're going to push it up to Heroku. And there's this really nice thing about Heroku now. They support secure websites right out of the box. Now, you may recall a while back that there was this Firefox application called Firesheep. This brought to a very broad audience this very important problem that if you're logged into a website like Facebook or Twitter, people can actually hijack your session. They can find out the unique string that Facebook, say, uses to verify that you are you. That's a cookie that's stored on your browser, and we're going to be creating one of those ourselves in the next lesson. So the problem with session hijacking is that essentially if you used Firesheep, or if you were more sophisticated and could just look at the traffic over the network, pretty much anybody with any sort of sophistication could log in as you if you happen to be using some sort of public wireless. So the way to prevent this is to use Secure Sockets Layer, or SSL, for every page on the site. Now, before this whole Firesheep incident, a lot of websites only used SSL for pages like a sign-up page or a sign-in page, but Firesheep showed everyone that this was unacceptable, and every page should have SSL enabled. So the way to do that is to go to the configuration file for production. Just to remind you, we actually made a change to the test configuration file. We put in these extra lines to speed up our test by changing the default cost for bcrypt. Now we're going to use the analogous file for production. So you can see it's in config environment production.rb. So what we want to do is use this line, force SSL equals true. Here it is. Let's uncomment that and save it. I'm going to add SSL in production. And now I'm going to push up to Heroku. Now, if you know anything about SSL, you know that in order to have a secure website, you need what's called a certificate. And one of the cool things about running on a Heroku subdomain is that we can piggyback on Heroku's SSL certificate. If you need to run your own custom domain with SSL, you'll need to buy a certificate of your own, and if you want to host that domain at Heroku, you should read about Heroku's support for SSL. But since we're running on a Heroku subdomain, we get SSL for free. Let's open it up. Alright, so the page is loaded now, and if you look at the URL, you can see that there's a little lock icon and HTTPS. So the S is for secure. So we're now running using HTTPS on the production server. And so let's sign up. So see if you can figure out what went wrong. This is a good debugging exercise. Let's look at the Heroku logs. Can scroll up here and see what the problem is. Completed 500, internal server error, active record statement invalid. So this is the line right here. PG error, so PG is Postgres, which is short for PostgreSQL, and it says relation users does not exist. So that's a hint that there's something wrong on the production database, and in fact, if you think about it, we haven't run the migration that we ran in the last lesson on the production database. So let's do that. Remember, locally we run rake db migrate, and the way to do that on Heroku is like this. We say Heroku run and then the command we want to run. You're likely to get these deprecation warnings. You should ignore them. Alright, so that migrated the production database. Let's refresh this page. And there we go. We have a sign-up page on the live web. Let's try it out. I'm going to sign in as me. And there we go. Welcome to the sample app. You'll note that I already have a Gravatar image associated with my email address. And you can also see that we've got a flash here. Let's just verify that it's working, and there it goes. Now that we can let users sign up to the site, now it's time to let them sign in and sign out. And that's the subject of the next lesson.